August 17, 1943, 7:42 a.m. Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched under the wide left wing of a P-38 Lightning at Doa Airfield in New Guinea. The sun was already turning the morning into a wall of heat, and he watched Lieutenant Robert Hayes climb into the cockpit. Hayes was only 23, with 6 missions behind him, and not a single enemy plane shot down. Today, he was flying into a patrol where 18 Japanese Zeros were waiting. It was a deadly mismatch. McKenna knew the P-38 better than anyone. For 8 months, he had worked on these machines, fast, powerful, and deadly in a straight line. But they had one terrible weakness: they couldn't turn with the Zero. The Zero was light, quick, and unbelievably agile. In a tight turn, it could swing around in half the time a P-38 needed. That small difference decided life and death. American pilots were told never to get into horizontal turns with Zeros, just dive in fast, take a shot, and climb away. But Hayes had tried that 5 times already, and each time the Zeros tricked him. The Japanese pilots were clever. They baited the Americans into turning, sliced inside their wide radius, got behind them, and fired. In 6 weeks, 37 P-38's had been lost this way. McKenna had watched too many bodies come back to base. Each time, the official instructors blamed pilot error, insisting the men simply failed to follow the rules. But McKenna, with grease on his hands and months of experience on the flight line, knew the real problem lived inside the aircraft itself. The P-38's aileron system, the cables that controlled the roll, had a tiny amount of slack, just 3/8 of an inch. On a fast dive, it didn't matter. But during slow, desperate, high-G turning fights, that tiny delay between the pilot moving the stick and the ailerons reacting became fatal. If a pilot needed the plane to roll now, the P-38 hesitated, just long enough for a Zero to line up its guns. 2 months earlier, McKenna had warned the engineering officer. The officer told him the tension was within factory limits. Trying to adjust it would void the warranty, and most importantly, mechanics weren't allowed to touch the flight control system without approval from Lockheed, an approval that would take months and required traveling halfway across the world. So McKenna broke the rules. One night, he pulled piano wire from a wrecked plane. He shaped it into a small Z form, then installed it secretly as a tensioner on the left aileron cable of Hayes's P-38. The modification took 8 minutes. It added less than half a pound of tension, but it removed the slack completely. No one noticed, and no one knew what McKenna had done as Hayes took off into the haze that morning. The next 17 minutes would change the future for every P-38 in the Pacific. McKenna still carried the memories of those who didn't come back. The first was Lieutenant David Chen, lost in July. Chen was young, only 3 weeks in the theater. Both he and McKenna were California boys, bonded over stories of home and cars. One morning, he returned with bullet holes in the left boom, narrowly saved by his wingman. He swore the plane hadn't rolled fast enough when he tried to escape the Zero. McKenna examined the damage-tight, precise grouping. The Zero pilot had anticipated exactly where Chen would be, which meant Chen hadn't been able to roll away in time. The next time McKenna heard of Chen, he was dead. Another P-38. Same story. Couldn't roll fast enough. Then there was Captain William Morrison, an ace with 11 kills, smart, skilled, respected. On August 3rd, he was shot down after reporting that his controls felt mushy during an escape maneuver. His crew chief, Rodriguez, checked everything. It was all within spec. The investigation blamed Morrison. Rodriguez didn't believe it, neither did McKenna. By mid-August, McKenna counted 17 dead pilots, all lost in the same way. The survivors all described the same feeling, a slight lag in the controls during hard turns. Most brushed it off as normal handling for a big fighter. But McKenna knew better. He could feel the slack in the cables every time he worked on one. He could even hear that loose cables made a duller, softer twang when plucked. and all the P-38 sounded that way. One evening, he told Rodriguez the truth. Rodriguez asked the obvious question, "Can we fix it?" McKenna explained the reality. Officially no, unofficially yes. But fixing it meant breaking regulations, risking both their careers, and possibly facing court-martial. McKenna had already taken that risk for Hayes. And now the P-38 with the secret fix was racing straight toward 18 zeros. The tragedy was never ignorance. Every American pilot in New Guinea knew the doctrine as though it had been carved into their bones. Never turn with a zero, use speed as both sword and shield, strike from above, then disappear. It was a strategy born from necessity, preached with the intensity of gospel truth. Yet Lieutenant Robert Hayes had followed every rule only to discover, repeatedly and painfully, that war cared nothing for doctrine. He had executed the perfect dive on his third mission, sun at his back, speed nearing 400 miles per hour, gun sight filling with the lean silhouette of a zero, only for the enemy aircraft to snap roll with inhuman agility and vanish before Hayes could even squeeze the trigger. His fourth sortie nearly killed him, not through recklessness, but through the P-38's reluctant roll rate, the machine answering his commands with a damning hesitation that allowed an enemy burst to stitch his right boom with cannon fire. And on his fifth mission, Hayes heard his wingman die over the radio. Thomas Parker's final moments were a crescendo of panic, disbelief, and the hollow realization that the P-38 simply could not turn fast enough to outrun death. The official verdict, pilot error, felt like an accusation carved into tombstones. McKenna lived with those verdicts every day. The smell of aviation fuel and scorched oil clung to him like a curse, each morning a reminder that he was preparing machines for combat that might not return. He had worked on Parker's fighter hours before the young man burned in the sky. He had tuned Chen's engines. He had reset Morrison's controls. The logs always read, "within spec," yet the graves kept filling. And on August 16th, the dam of silent frustration finally cracked when Hayes approached him under the dim light of the maintenance bay, desperation raw in his voice. Hayes didn't plead. He demanded a chance to live, to fight back, to stop being prey. McKenna saw the truth in the young man's trembling hands and tight jaw. This wasn't fear of combat, but fear of inevitability. Something had to change, and if no officer would authorize it, then McKenna would do it alone. That night, the hangar became a confessional of mechanical rebellion. Sweat dripped into McKenna's eyes as he wrestled the salvage piano wire into a Z-shaped tensioner, the pliers slipping until the wire sliced his thumb. Grease mixed with blood as he crawled into the cramped left boom, shoulder scraping against metal, flashlight beam jittering across the intricate maze of pulleys. Every loose cable he touched felt like a death sentence. He worked in silence, knowing each minute brought him closer to discovery, court-martial, disgrace. Yet when he inserted the wire and pulled the cable taut, zero slack, instant response, his heart surged with a fragile, dangerous hope. He sealed the panel, wiped away the blood, and stepped into the heavy tropical night, knowing he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. At dawn, he watched Hayes climb into the cockpit of the only P-38 on the entire airfield that could finally roll when a life depended on it. And as the fighter lifted into the morning haze at 7:42, McKenna stood rooted to the earth, knowing that the next 17 minutes would either vindicate his crime or destroy him. The engagement began at 8:14. Hayes's element of 4 P-38's successfully intercepted 9 zeros at 13,000 feet over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun, strategically behind them, provided the perfect advantage for a diving attack. Hayes, flying in the number 3 position, heard his element leader call out the bounce, and they rolled in. Hayes selected a zero positioned at the rear of the enemy formation. He dove, accelerating his speed to 380 miles per hour. The Zero rapidly expanded in his gun sight. He could clearly discern the painted rising sun emblem on the fuselage and the pilot's helmet inside the canopy. He pressed the firing button. The combined power of the 4.50 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm cannon hammered their tracers toward the enemy. Most of the rounds missed, but a few struck the Zero's wing, sparking briefly, not enough damage to stop it. The Zero snap-rolled fiercely to the right and plunged into a dive. Hayes immediately rolled to follow, and at that precise moment, he felt the change. The aircraft responded instantly. There was no delay, no lag whatsoever. The stick moved, and the aircraft rolled immediately in perfect responsive harmony. Hayes had never felt his P-38 perform with such instantaneous obedience. It was as though the machine had been awaiting his exact command and executed it the very moment it was issued. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the time he was accustomed to. He pulled his nose down. The Zero was perfectly framed in his sight picture. He fired a second, 3-second burst. The rounds walked deliberately up the Zero's fuselage, starting at the tail and continuing all the way to the cockpit. The Zero's engine violently exploded, pieces tearing away from the aircraft. It rolled inverted and tumbled toward the jungle below, leaving a thick trail of black smoke. It was Hayes's first kill, but there was no time for elation. His wingman shouted a warning. Zeros were diving from above. Hayes glanced up, spotting 3 enemy aircraft descending in a shallow dive, closing fast. They had witnessed the destruction of their comrade and now sought vengeance. Hayes shoved his throttles forward, initiating a desperate climb, but the Zeros held the speed advantage in the dive. They would intercept him in seconds. His only viable option was a violent reversal and engagement. Every fiber of his being screamed to follow the doctrine, keep climbing, keep running. But doctrine, he realized, meant certain death today. He pulled the stick hard left, and the P-38 snapped around with a responsiveness he had never imagined. The nose swept cleanly through the horizon. He sighted the lead Zero. The enemy pilot was attempting to follow, but he had clearly not anticipated Hayes reversing direction so swiftly. The Zero was dangerously exposed in a vulnerable position. Hayes pulled the lead and fired. The Zero took a hit at the left wing root. The wing instantly folded, and the Zero tumbled, a wreck. 2 kills in 30 breathtaking seconds. The 2 remaining Zeros attempted a scissors maneuver, alternating turns in a bid to force Hayes into an overshoot, but Hayes stayed precisely with them. Every time they switched direction, his P-38 snapped into the new turn instantly. There was no delay, no struggle against the unresponsive controls. The aircraft obeyed his every command the very instant he issued it. It felt profoundly different, as if invisible weights had been lifted from the control system. 1 Zero committed the decisive error. It reversed too forcefully, causing it to bleed too much airspeed. Hayes seized the opportunity, cutting inside its turn. At extremely close range, perhaps only 200 feet, he fired. It was impossible to miss. The Zero disintegrated, pieces of the aircraft flying past Hayes's canopy. He felt his P-38 shudder slightly as debris impacted the right boom. 3 kills. The 4th Zero, witnessing the swift, brutal destruction of its comrades, broke off and fled. Hayes, critically low on fuel and ammunition, did not pursue. He climbed back to a higher altitude, reformed with the remnants of his flight, and they headed for home. The entire life-altering engagement had lasted a mere 7 minutes. When Hayes touched down at Doadora at 9:03, McKenna was waiting, a silent sentinel on the flight line. Hayes shut down the engines and climbed out, his hands shaking, his flight suit darkened with sweat. He walked directly toward McKenna. His entire experience was distilled into 2 potent words. It worked. Unknown to both the mechanic and the pilot, 6 other pilots had witnessed Hayes's incredible performance from a higher altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell, a seasoned flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, had observed the entire chaotic fight from 15,000 feet. He noticed something profoundly unusual. Hayes's P-38 was rolling with a speed and aggression unlike any lightning Mitchell had ever encountered. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers as if its weight had been suddenly halved. Mitchell was familiar with the skill levels of every pilot in the theater. Hayes was capable, but not that good. Something fundamental had been altered in his machine. After landing, Mitchell tracked Hayes down in the debriefing room. Hayes was still surging with adrenaline, his hands trembling as he dictated his combat report. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked him directly what had changed. Hayes, perhaps still processing the fight, said he didn't know, only that his plane had responded better, faster that day. Mitchell then asked if the maintenance crew had made any adjustments. Hayes directed him to Technical Sergeant McKenna. Mitchell found McKenna 2 hours later in the maintenance area, focused on a different P-38. His hands were black with grease, his coveralls streaked with hydraulic fluid. Mitchell cut straight to the core of the issue. "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna paused, looking at the captain for a long, calculating moment before finally admitting the truth. He described the piano wire tensioner, the cable modification, and the utterly unauthorized change to the flight control system. Mitchell listened silently as McKenna confessed everything. He didn't interrupt once. When McKenna finally finished, Mitchell asked only one question. Could he make the same modification on his own aircraft? McKenna agreed, but insisted that Mitchell fully understand the danger. The fix had no official approval, it had never been formally tested, and if anything went wrong, both of them would face serious charges. Mitchell didn't care. He had lost 4 pilots in the past month, men who died trapped in turning fights they could not escape. If there was even a chance this modification could save lives, he wanted it. Regulations, he said, could wait. That night, McKenna worked on Mitchell's P-38, installing the piano wire tensioner using the same improvised method he had used before. Mitchell took the airplane up the next morning and returned overflowing with excitement. The difference was stunning. The P-38 no longer rolled like a heavy truck, it moved like a real fighter. Mitchell immediately told his wingman, who hurried to McKenna, to request the same change. By August 20th, McKenna had secretly modified 9 aircraft. Word raced through the squadron. Pilots whispered about the rumored cable fix, asking their crew chiefs whether it was real. Some crew chiefs refused out of fear of breaking regulations. Others were willing to take the risk. Soon, McKenna was quietly training them, teaching them how to cut the piano wire, bend it into the Z-shape, and slip it into the control cable as a tensioner. The job took less than 10 minutes, but it completely changed how the aircraft behaved. The modification spread like a secret language, pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic. There were no forms, no orders, no official guidance, just quiet conversations in the ready room and around the aircraft. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd after experiencing the new responsiveness. Mitchell scored 3 more on August 25th. Pilots who had struggled for months suddenly began returning with confirmed kills. The improvement soon caught the attention of others. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief from the 49th Fighter Group at Gussop, heard the rumor from a pilot who had transferred from Doa-Dura. Watkins doubted the story, but decided to try the modification on one P-38. The pilot returned from his next mission with his first kill after 8 empty weeks. Watkins became a believer and immediately modified 4 more aircraft. Within days, other crew chiefs followed his lead. By early September, roughly 40 P-38’s across New Guinea were flying with McKenna's hidden fix. The engineering officer at Doa-Dura sensed something had changed, but he couldn't find the source. Cable tension readings always looked normal during inspections because crew chiefs quietly removed the tensioners before the inspectors arrived, then reinstalled them once they left. The pilots knew The mechanics knew. The officers knew nothing. The shift in kill ratios made the change impossible to ignore. In July, American pilots had been losing 2 P-38's for every 0 destroyed. By August, the ratio had narrowed to 1.3 to 1. By September, the exchange was nearly even. Something huge had changed, but officially, no one understood what it was. The Japanese, surprisingly, were the first to recognize the tactical difference. In late August, Japanese pilots reported that P-38's were rolling faster into turns and reversing more aggressively. Their proven maneuvers, timed perfectly for the P-38's sluggish roll, were suddenly failing. On September 3rd, Japan's famed ace, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, engaged a P-38 near Wewak. He used his classic tactic, forcing the P-38 into a turning fight, then snapping back in the opposite direction to gain position. It had worked flawlessly for 2 years, but this time the P-38 reversed just as fast as he did. Sakai nearly collided with it, shocked by the fighter's new agility. Forced to break away, he returned to base shaken and frustrated. Other Japanese aces soon filed similar reports. The Americans were not using new tactics. Their planes were simply responding quicker, just fast enough to break the delicate timing Japanese pilots depended on. Japanese intelligence examined downed P-38's but found nothing unusual. Engines, guns, airframes, everything looked the same. They could not imagine that the advantage came from a tiny piece of wire hidden deep inside the boom. By mid-September, Japanese losses rose sharply. Their confidence, built on the Zero's dominance in turning fights, began to crumble. Some pilots avoided dogfights entirely, resorting to hit-and-run tactics that threw away the Zero's main advantage. Others pressed harder, trying riskier maneuvers, but without their previous edge, these gambles often turned fatal. Their problem was simple. They were fighting against a modification they could not see, and therefore could not counter. And without understanding the change, they could only suffer its effects. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters to P-38's. American losses were 22. For the first time in the Pacific, the kill ratio had flipped. Japanese headquarters issued a new order: avoid combat with P-38's unless they had overwhelming numbers. The Zero, once the hunter, had become the hunted, all because of a 6-inch strip of piano wire that regulations would never have allowed. The modification remained unofficial throughout the war. In October 1943, it finally came to the attention of the Army Air Force Engineering Command, when a maintenance inspector at Doadora noticed irregular cable tension readings and traced them back to the hidden wire tensioners. He filed a full report and sent it up the chain, unknowingly exposing the truth behind the quiet revolution happening in the skies. For 3 weeks, the report stagnated on various officers' desks as they bitterly debated the appropriate action. The modification was undeniably a flagrant violation of military regulation. However, it was demonstrably effective. The fighter squadrons using the altered aircraft possessed measurably superior kill ratios, and pilots were surviving at higher rates. The central question was not whether the modification worked, but whether the mechanics who installed it without authorization should be severely punished, or if the system should quietly approve the fait accompli. In November, Lockheed finally sent an engineering team to New Guinea to study the strange field modification they kept hearing rumors about. They measured the tightened cables, checked the stress on the controls, and put the aircraft through careful test flights. Their conclusion was simple: the fix worked, it was safe, and it should have been part of the P-38 from the beginning. Because of this discovery, Lockheed added a similar tensioning system to the new P-38J model, which began production in December 1943. The idea that started as a risky, late-night act by one mechanic became a permanent feature of the aircraft. Yet the man who made it possible, Technical Sergeant James McKenna, received nothing: no medal, no written praise, not even a line in an official report. Lockheed's documents credited the improvement to general engineering analysis, quietly removing McKenna from the record. On paper, he didn't exist, but for the pilots who survived because of him, the truth lived on. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the pilot who had been desperate enough to ask McKenna for help, survived the war. He flew 63 missions and earned 11 confirmed victories. After returning home to Iowa in 1945, he married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and spent nearly 4 decades as a crop duster. But every August 17th, without fail, he called McKenna just to say thank you. He knew exactly whose hands had given him a future. Captain Frank Mitchell survived too. He went on to lead his squadron through the brutal Philippines campaign and finished the war with 16 aerial victories. He stayed in the Air Force until 1963, eventually retiring as a colonel. Mitchell made it his duty to tell every young maintenance officer the truth, that sometimes the most important solutions don't come from engineering offices or official blueprints. They come from the mechanics who work closest to danger, who see the problems others never notice. McKenna himself stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946. Then he returned to California and went back to what he knew best, fixing engines. In 1948, he opened a garage in Long Beach, where he worked for 42 years. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he simply said he fixed airplanes, nothing more. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 upgrades found strange references to a piano wire tensioner in old maintenance logs. Curious, he tracked down McKenna, who was 73 and still working part-time in his shop. McKenna confirmed the story, but brushed it off as nothing special. The historian, however, estimated that his unauthorized fix saved between 80 and 100 pilots. McKenna didn't want to think about numbers. He only kept the names of the men who came home. That, he said, was enough. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. His obituary mentioned his service as an aircraft mechanic, but said nothing about the invention that changed the way American fighters were handled in combat. It never mentioned how many lives he saved, or that he once broke rules on purpose because he refused to watch any more young pilots die. His old garage still stands under new owners. And in the back office, there's a faded photograph hanging on the wall. It shows a young mechanic in stained coveralls, standing proudly beside a P-38 Lightning. On the back, someone once wrote, August 1943, New Guinea. That picture tells the real story, the story of how innovation in war often comes not from official orders, but from people like McKenna who act when no one else does. The piano wire, a tiny segment of metal costing pennies, demonstrated that the difference between pilot error and combat success was often merely a matter of mechanical responsiveness, not skill. It forces a profound consideration. How many seemingly insurmountable problems in the battles of life or industry are not failures of human capability, but instead the result of accepting standards that are merely within specification, a tolerance that, in its subtle allowance for sluggishness, silently dictates the difference between a tragic loss and triumphant survival? We often celebrate the heroes who fly the machines, but we must never forget the quiet, defiant heroes on the ground who first ensured those machines could truly fight.